Yeah.
I,
Yeah, now it's recording.
okay.
Okay, Lisa, hello. It's nice to have you here. Lisa Haber-Thomson, for all the people who don't know her, she is an architect. She's PhD from Harvard University. Her dissertation was about law studies on architecture. She can talk a bit more about that herself. She's part of the art program in the Harvard GSD faculty, and she's also teaching courses on architecture theory, not only in the design like kind of field, but in an open field in Harvard University. She can talk more about that. But mostly, we invited her to this interview because she was one of the producers of this architecture MOOC, massive open online course on architecture, one of the most important ones that's been produced so far, which is Architecture and Imagination, which she worked together with other GSD professors such as Michael Hayes, Toby Cohn, and Eli Canagis. And thank you, Lisa, for accepting this invitation. And I hope we can find some new paths which are open now after the pandemic in how to make this MOOC format something like and look towards the future, not only as an impoverished version of the real thing. Now we have seen that this online education actually works. It's not so bad. So yeah. Thank you, Lisa. So first, as an introduction, I would want to introduce yourself a bit about your background, particularly your experience on teaching and researching. And please consider that learning and MOOC questions come after this. This is more like an introduction about yourself, what you want to bring up to this conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for inviting me to this conversation. I am currently teaching at the GSD. I teach both design studio courses and also history and theory seminars and lecture courses currently. But one of the ways that I got involved in online education is because of my background in video production, actually. So I did my undergraduate degree in fine arts, and I worked in film and video production for a few years after my undergrad degree. In particular, I worked for a subsidiary of PBS, of public broadcasting, making nature documentaries. So when Michael Hayes was working on his first online course, he asked if I could help him out in terms of producing the material that would go behind some of the filmed lectures. And so that's sort of how I became interested in online education, in particular way of thinking about virtual pedagogy as sort of a different mode of teaching that was related, but actually quite different from the kind of teaching that we do in person. So that's an interest that sort of happened sort of haphazardly, but that I've continued to be interested in, and clearly has become more pressing given the current situation.
And before we go to the next question, how would you say, Lisa, that your background as architect and your background in this film studies or video production relate to each other, because they're completely different fields?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
How do you think your two backgrounds, one on architecture and the other in audiovisual studies or production, relate to each other?
Well, yeah, no, that's a great question. I think it's very related to how I think about online education for architecture in particular, because it's quite clear that these are, I see it in a way as just thinking about different media and what each form of media can tell us about the subject at hand. And clearly, I think for both filmmaking and for architecture, these two questions are completely intertwined with one another. You can't really separate the media from the content. And so although we could say that they're different media, when you're thinking about video production, when you're thinking about architecture production or film, and thinking about film production, each of these three kinds of medias has really specific implications for the kind of work that you can produce, and the kinds of ways that you can think about that work being produced. So to me, it feels quite entangled, in a way I think beneficial for the field of architecture when thinking about virtual teaching, because it's questions that we're already thinking about and working through.
Interesting, and I'm sorry, I made too many parentheses, but there was this lecture, I think, no, it was more like a conversation last semester between one of the partners of Norman Kelly and the director Heinz Emicholt. I don't know if you saw that.
No.
And he has a very interesting approach, similar to what you say, in how architecture and everything relate. And he frames it under the title that architecture as or is autobiography. That architecture is actually what you experience of architecture. It's not more or less than that. So in a way, I agree on that. And also my own experience with audiovisual and architecture is kind of the same. So we're on the same page. That's good.
Yeah, and it's really interesting too, because both of these mediums, I think, require, I think in the past might have been attributed to a single author. So in a way you could say that it's biographical in that sense. But I think now our understanding of them has really shifted to take into account the huge amount of production that goes in and involving a huge number of different people and constituencies. So then all of a sudden the biographical question comes in not so much with the authorship, but with the reception, let's say, or the interpretation. And I think, I think that feels similar to both of these mediums, that each of them have a large sort of sometimes unseen role that's played by a huge number of people that goes into its production. That's tangent.
No, but I think it's important because this kind of frames your approach to the MOOC, like what we're talking after. And what I have to say about that is that also architecture, such as like a movie, has this very open to, even if architecture with capital A doesn't like it, it's very open to multiple subjectivities. And in a way, internet, which when you mix it with audiovisual field or architecture field, makes that multiple subjectivities, some very dark and hateful ones, to be much more available. So I think for me, just to preview what my position here is, that there's much potential in that. Much more multiple views on what architecture or film together can be.
And that, that was one of the things that we were thinking about very specifically when we were working on the architectural imagination, insofar as we wanted it to be very clear that we had a position with regards to the material. So we were not aiming to present it as a neutral stance on architecture. We wanted it to be extremely apparent that we were building an argument. And in that sense, my feeling was that it therefore lent itself to be open to other interpretations or open to an argument, which to me feels very valuable, especially when you're thinking about education or pedagogy. We weren't trying to say that this is the way to look at architecture. We were trying to say, here is a series of ways that one can look at architecture that's framed by a very specific set of historical examples. But throughout, we were very clear that our aim was to reveal, let's say, the artifice of the construction of both the buildings and of the historical situation through which we would interpret those buildings.
Thank you, Lisa. Now to second question. So this particularly on e-learning, like very broadly. So which was your view on distance learning, not necessarily electronic, could be like postal learning, before participating on this MOOC? Did you saw it as an impoverished or poor substitute of the real thing, or you didn't?
Well, to be honest, I had never done any MOOCs before or even looked at them. And so I guess you could say I had the sort of a willful ignorance when I was approaching the project. But from the beginning, I think I made it very clear that it was only going to be an interesting project if we did not see it as an impoverished version of the real thing. And I think this goes back to the question of media, that we have to take very seriously the media, now not just of video and of architecture, but the medium of this online learning platform. That itself is a specific kind of production. And to me, it was only going to be successful if we took that seriously as such. So there was never any attempt to say, this is just going to be like a lecture course that would happen in person. It was to say, what can we do differently? What can be done differently? What should be done differently given this online environment? And I think, I still feel that that's the only way to do this kind of thing successfully, because there are many things that are just better in the real world, and there are many things that work better in this environment. And I think just, our first task is just making that distinction between those two things.
I'm not going to ask you like a lot about the MOOC in particular, like what did you do in the MOOC? But with the other conversation we had with Yosuke Oguchi from Tokyo University, he talked a lot about money, about how the budget like came short because it's like an experiment as it was for you. So can you talk a bit about that? Like
about the budget?
Yeah. Did you consider like a good budget?
Yeah.
You can disclose how much money was involved, like stuff like that. I think I like to talk about money because it's not
huge.
like it's important subject.
Yeah. No, this is huge. And, I have to say that I think that this is where my specific work experience in public broadcasting played a huge role because, back then we would be asked to fabricate these setups to demonstrate a scientific principle, but we'd have like a $10 budget, so we would just make sets out of a fish tank and some dirt and some mud and pretend that this was the solar system, but it worked out pretty well, and that we took that attitude towards this because we wanted to have a lot of images. We wanted to have a lot of good images, but we also had no money whatsoever. So almost immediately we scrapped the idea of doing site visits just because it would cost too much. But then the more that we thought about it, the more we realized that since this was not just a course about architecture, but a course about architectural history, that actually if we use the archival documents, which are image-based and which we can show on the screen quite well, that this would actually be a much better way of teaching and demonstrating that history. And once again, always pointing to the artifact itself, like the drawing itself as such, as part of how we're understanding the history of that building. So it did two things. It made it much cheaper for us because we were able to use archival material that a lot of times was in the public domain, so we didn't really have to pay rates for it. But the other thing that it did is I think really reinforce this point about the sort of constructed nature of history, or at least our position towards architecture and its history. So yeah, we thought about that a lot. One of the things that we definitely did do that maybe we spent the money on was that we hired an animator that had a background in architecture, and that I think was totally invaluable. So I think we could have done this work without her. Her name's Helen Hahn. She's amazing. That's a shout out to Helen. She is also a GSD grad and is really involved in architectural representation through video work. And it was really important because there was some of the material that we wanted to show through diagrams and animated diagrams, and she was able to understand immediately the task at hand. And so I think that still makes sense to me when I'm thinking back on the project, that we saved the money for a site visit to give to Helen to help us show some of these projects in a more sort of diagrammatic, animated kind of way that really helped sort of push the point forward.
In the case of Tokyo University, because I know this is like a new brand of architecture online course history going on right now with us talking about this, that they spent like, I don't know the exact figure, but he said like, I don't know, like half of the budget in this very famous musical composer, like incidental music composer that's now he made the music for Tokyo Olympics, for example. He's Japanese living in Paris. So they spent half of the money on him. They paid him in advance. He made the music. And they ran out of money for this MOOC on the Tokyo University MOOC. I don't know if you've seen it, it's quite good. And so they use the music as the guideline for the whole MOOC, which is quite weird because the money went there, and then the rest of the stuff they have to play, like with $10, like being smart and find ways, which is another part of the imagination of doing this, which is like all new because it's doing this for architecture is completely different than doing it for TV or just.
Yeah, absolutely.
So one question coming out now that you're talking is that you don't have to reply this if you're uncomfortable with it, but did you find any way to bend the rules of copyright law so to spend money on that? For instance, it's like what, I don't know if you like hip hop, but these Houston rappers that they slow mode, they make their voice slow so they don't have to, like, YouTube doesn't block their music.
Well, no, the thing is, I'm actually kind of interested in this kind of thing. So I spent a good time trying to understand it. But we were quite clear from the beginning. We were working from the beginning with the copyright lawyer at Harvard-X because they're very, very careful about those kinds of things. But I kind of took it on as a challenge. There's fairly clear guidelines that they give for pedagogical fair use. So you have to be able to refer to the material specifically when you're talking about it, for example. But, a lot of the times, because we were directly referring to material, we didn't really have that problem. The one time that was the stretch is when Michael Hayes really wanted to use a Rolling Stone song as a way to illustrate sort of the political unrest of the 1960s. And we were like, Michael, it's a Rolling Stones, like we can't have that song. And we said, the only way we can even get a clip of it is if you say specifically this Rolling Stone song, and we can play the clip over you talking about it. So he did that. But other than that, everything that we were doing was already kind of manipulated in a way that you're describing. So, when we have an image that's getting animated on, or images that are being used to illustrate in a very specific kind of sequence, an argument, it already falls into that transformative fair use that you're claiming. We have to think about this a lot, especially with regards to Le Corbusier, because as I'm sure all of his work is very tightly guarded by the Fondation. But because, again, we were using it to illustrate a point, because we had Helen animate those drawings, we were able to abide by those regulations in a way that I think was successful. So I think Michael and the Rolling Stones was only disappointment, but we managed to sneak it in.
I know, because if in Japan or in the US you have the issue, but if we were doing this in Chile, like would it compare the pirate group, so yeah. I would take a completely different turn, because we don't care about that, like we should, but we actually don't.
Well, we had an insane, because we had to have everything vetted by Harvard-X. Honestly, it was a useful exercise for us, because we had to keep track of everything. They call it assets. So every part of the course that you use, whether it's an image, whether it's a music clip, whether it's anything, is called a course asset. And we had this massive spreadsheet that keeps track of them. And I can't remember the exact number, but the guy that we were working with at Harvard-X was saying that the typical Harvard-X course has something like 100 assets for the whole course, and we had thousands, because we had all of these images that we were using, and we're not going to have a 20-minute long lecture segment with only one image on it. So we had probably 200 images for that, or sometimes more. And so we had to keep track of every single one of them, where the provenance of those images, whether or not it fell into public domain, whether or not we had to make an argument for pedagogical fair use. And then every single element that wasn't in the public domain, we did in fact have to make an argument for fair use, which again was logged in a separate part of that spreadsheet. So every single image, every single clip, every single thing in that is sort of logged in that kind of way, which feels sort of bureaucratic, but I think was also kind of useful and really interesting to look at all of the material that was gathered in the course of this production. So again, we relied heavily on a lot of archival material, and have a sort of a nice little package of all that coming out of the project.
So next question, I think you already talked about this backstage. So instead about the MOOC itself, we'd like to know about all the crazy ideas that didn't see the light. Which ones were your favorites? Which ones couldn't work out? You can name the reasons or not, or which ones simply were impossible at that time, maybe.
Well, we really wanted to do a lot of the things that we wanted to do had to do less with the MOOC part of it and more with making the MOOC more of an interactive experience for students, and that we didn't really get to, or kind of didn't really work out. So some of the assignments that we had our students do, we had them do drawing assignments, and they were really amazing to see, because you had these people from all over the world, from age 7 to age I can't remember the oldest person taking the course, but in their 80s or 90s, all backgrounds of levels of education, drawing a diagram of their living space. That was the first assignment that we did. So we had them draw a plan. We had them think about wall thickness and furniture and all that. So the exercise was about how to read architectural drawings, but we had them do it through drawing their own space. And the things that got submitted were just incredible. And we really wanted to have a gallery, a physical gallery, not an online gallery, but we wanted to produce these all up and have them in Gund Hall and have a physical exhibition of all these amazing drawings. And we never really got to it. And then we wanted to have a camera crew and then invite everyone in for like a live stream of the opening. And it's kind of cheesy, but we really like the idea of having the ability to see all this work and to show, the GSD, all this kind of really amazing stuff that came out of this totally widespread sampling of people around the world. So that's the one that I think I regret the most not getting to, and maybe one day we can make that happen.
The Tokyo University people, which are more fetishist like you than you, they actually made a book about the book.
They did?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
No, and the other book I'm researching a bit on is the one made by Tokyo Institute of Technology, which is the school of Abel Bawao and Shinohara, and they Tokyo University and Tokyo Institute of Technology, they kind of have some kind of feud between them. I don't know, which could be comparing the US, like maybe Harvard and Yale or something like that. And they compete a lot, so they display their own architects in each book. They don't talk much about the other side, so they kind of and it's interesting in the case of Japan, maybe in yours as well. It's an interesting way to rewrite history. You have the power to make a testament that hasn't been done before, which is this online course, which the other side requires a lot of maintenance, And you already talked about that. The forum in itself, or the submissions that you get from students, they require a lot of time. And Oguchi was telling that was like a full day job. What do you talk how to make that more, efficient or interesting?
Yeah, this was one of the things that we never really figured out, and one of the things that I think is really worthwhile thinking through, which is student work that gets submitted and the way that it's assessed, or that's the terminology that they use. They had edX has a couple of different models that they use. So the easiest, of course, are things that are automatically graded, so like a multiple choice quiz kind of thing. The other thing that they rely on a lot is peer review. And there's a number of reasons which you can imagine that those two models didn't seem all that useful for a course on architectural history all the time. So we had to think really carefully about student assessment and student work. We did end up writing some multiple choice quizzes that were actually a kind of a revelation for me in terms of thinking about teaching readings. They were very specifically related to readings that we would assign. And the multiple choice questions were written as sort of a reading guide rather than a quiz per se. I mean, we didn't care if people got a good grade or not. It was more just that the questions that we wrote would focus students' attention on certain parts of the reading and help them sort of guide them through it. The other thing that we decided to do instead of a peer review assessment was to do a self-assessment, which meant that we wrote kind of like our own answers to small essay assignments that students could then use to check against. And they weren't like answers as if we wrote the answers ourselves, but they were more like, when you were thinking through this essay prompt, did you consider X, Y, and Z? So again, it was like one more step in a student's learning process beyond getting direct feedback on their work. But that being said, I think something that for sure gets lost in these kind of anonymous and massive courses, that it's really difficult for us to get a sense of how students are learning and what they're learning without, as you say, going through these, a massive amount of data that's coming in, and there's not really a good way to streamline that. And, I don't know if there ever should be. This to me is one of the places where it seems like you need actually not anonymity. You need to have interaction with instructors. You need to be able to take the time to read student work. And so that's a place where I think we can maybe make some steps towards these self-assessment or these quizzes, but at the end of the day, I think there are places that need more active engagement. That's where I'm feeling about this now,
No, I know how you're feeling, but I think the potential lies, like sadly, I would say, more in the automation than in the mixed thing, in the sense that the assessment or the evaluation could be completely automated, but that would need a lot of more investment, I would say.
Yeah.
Instead of having your crew, having your entourage, you have to spend a lot of money on programming.
Yeah, and I don't know. I don't even know what the value of that would be. I mean, maybe for certain kinds of assessments it would work, but for things like, it would immediately go to like a design project, for example, or even to an essay. I don't think that should be automized. There's only so far that you can get with that kind of evaluation, and I think that would really remove a lot of the important part of architectural education, which is learning how to have a conversation or learning how to develop discourse. And as soon as you make feedback automated, you're removing the possibility for discourse, or for removing the possibility for a conversation to develop between and across students and instructors and the wider design field. So to me, I don't actually see much interest in that. I think there are places that could be productive. For example, maybe in the certain ways that you structure sort of a first round of feedback, but then I think would need to be followed up by other ways of engagement that to me feel very difficult to scale.
Yeah. No, I think it's like very open-ended thing.
Yeah.
And this is the next question. So have you seen other MOOCs, like not only architecture MOOCs, like maybe some chemistry or biology that have some specific things that you have found interesting? I mean, before making this MOOC or maybe after it, there's some part maybe on the assessment, maybe on the audiovisual part, maybe on the, I don't know, like the subject, how did they deal with the subjects? Have you seen any other examples that you would like to recall besides yours, of course?
I haven't spent a lot of time looking at a lot of them. I do really like. I still watch a lot of nature documentaries, and so I think I take this a little bit still as my model, because they're a lot of times produced by experts in fields that are have a very specific goal towards imparting information in a way that's accessible. So for me, I learned a lot from watching PBS still. In terms of official MOOCs, I really like Peter Gallison's Einstein one. I don't know if you've seen that one. And I was thinking about that. So he is a historian of science who also has a background in physics. I can't remember what kind. And one of the reasons I really like that one, and I've been thinking about it a lot, because of what we can maybe learn from it. The subject is Einstein in all of the ways that theories of relativity have influenced the world, from both the science level all the way to cultural and pop cultural levels. And so it's incredibly interdisciplinary, and I think in that respect really lends itself to the format. So again, he clearly has a lot of fun when he's explaining very complicated scientific ideas, but then talking about how they reverberate in like an episode of Star Trek, for example. So I think it's really great, and I think again, like goes back to the idea of figuring out how to present complicated ideas to a wide audience without watering down, let's say, theories of relativity. And I think that's, taking seriously your audience, or taking seriously the intellectual capabilities of your audience, I think is super important in all of these projects. And that's one of the things that I really admire about that course in particular.
Have you seen Frank Gehry's masterclass course?
I never watched it all the way through. Is it good?
I think
he's a charming guy.
It's intimate, I would say.
Yeah.
Intimate. Like the guy is like, sounds very like, of course he's showing off, but he's very sincere in his way of showing off, which I think is good. But all the rest is crap, I think. All the rest is like very well funded.
You're embarrassing me because I clearly should have seen it.
Yeah, because it's like the private, no, not the private, but
yeah,
an institutional version of a MOOC.
Yeah.
because the MOOCs can be made by private institutions, but it's like a very informal and very profitable way of making a MOOC, which I think is an interesting way. But I think they have so much money and they spend so little in the assessment. They spend a lot on the video. Maybe they know that the assessment doesn't really work.
Yeah, well, no. I mean, that was like my immediate thought, because I think I watched the trailer for it, and then I watched the first episode of it. And the entire time I was just thinking like how much money that camera rig cost. I couldn't get it out of my head. So that, I think that's my fault a little bit for not looking beyond that. But clearly, to me, that feels like in a completely different category for what we're doing. It feels extremely polished and for an audience that has a very specific view of architecture, maybe a less questioning view, let's say. But I could be wrong because I haven't seen it all the way through. So I would need to give it its time to make really judgments on it.
Yeah, but I think very, very surprising that for because he's a really experimental architecture, but in a way, this stuff is very weird, but he becomes like an objective of an aspiration, which is completely contradictory. Like how would you, like, as a mainstream architect, want to be a king? Which is impossible.
Yeah.
Maybe a different topic. Then MOOC Plus. So, and this is more like on your specific MOOC. After you finish the MOOC, and this is with any ambitious project, not only a MOOC, you tend to look back at it and see some things that you would like to change, improve, or add. So, please share with us how would you do a better second edition of the MOOC you participated in, and please consider the question on a post-COVID scenario. We'll come after.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think one of the things that feels funny about these is that they have specific brackets, let's say, for how long they should be. And so I always thought that this project should be expanded. So we have very specific kinds of examples that are getting used that are sort of really amazing. And I think having just to expand it to cover more examples throughout a broader depth of architectural history, I think would be clearly a way to build on the project as it stands. I think a second thing, which I think builds on what we were talking about just earlier now, I would really want to actually take a look at the work that students submitted before we would think about how to rethink it. Because for me, there's sort of an unmined database there of the way that students engaged with the work that, as you mentioned, would take actually months to go through and to analyze in a way that was serious. I think that would be a really interesting project, and I think would be worthwhile because, as I mentioned, we spent a good deal of time with Michael really trying to think through the assignments carefully about what they could be teaching students about architecture. And it's still a little bit open-ended to what extent they worked. I mean, we think that they worked because we spent a lot of time developing them, and we got a lot of responses that resonated really well, we thought. But I think it would be worthwhile taking a look at them again and seeing how we could expand specifically student work and student assignments, given that a lot of them were really interested in working through design. So how could we come up with other design exercises that would be useful for students that want to learn about architecture, knowing that they weren't necessarily designers or going into professional programs.
Thank you. And I would put this maybe for the last one, but like we could agree that the MOOC as a format has increased its value with the COVID-19 pandemic, and maybe that's also what I'm doing all these interviews. So access is clearly easier during lockdown compared to in-person courses, yet the user experience is still a way lag behind the old school format. Like old school professors with their charisma, it's very hard for them to transmit their charisma to the screen. So the first wave of architecture MOOCs, the ones by you in Harvard, or the University and Tokyo Institute of Technology, which are the three more interesting for me, stand out in my opinion, are no like case studies for future developments. So where do you think things should go now on with MOOCs on architecture? First of all, do you think MOOCs in our field should follow the same routes as the one in other disciplines, or they should take other steps?
Okay, I think so. There's maybe a couple of questions wrapped up in there. So the first, maybe about the future of MOOCs in general. let's say. I think one of the things that to me seems the most important, and this is what I mentioned at the very beginning, is that in order for them to be successful, I think they really have to be understood as a different form of teaching. And I think that's very difficult to really understand at first, because you're thinking about doing a lecture online. At first glance, it might look actually like it's very similar to lecturing in person. But I think the moment that you realize that it's actually quite different, that there's all kinds of ways in which you relate to the screen differently, your students are relating to the screen differently, you're able to present material in an actually much more intimate way sometimes, and yet the personal interaction between students and instructors is quite impoverished. Once you take all those things very seriously, I think you have a much better way of grappling with this new kind of course development. So basically not thinking about it as the same as your in-person lecture, thinking about it as a whole different type, I think would lead to the most successful way of implementing it if there's interest in it. I think the other thing that's really important to keep in mind is that I still really believe that there are things that just can't be taught well virtually. And I mentioned this before, I think one of the first things to do is to try to figure out what those are and to try to not force a virtual replacement for them. So, I mean, it could mean, and for what we're doing right now, is to thinking about other ways of imparting the similar kinds of information or similar kinds of techniques, but in a different way, with the acknowledgement that in-person modes of teaching those things aren't possible in a virtual way. So that means just rethinking entirely whole modes of teaching. I think that's really important because I think, once you start to say, like, how can I do a virtual X? It's not going to go as well as if you just say, like, I'm trying to teach a technique in representation. Given this online environment, how can I best do that? To me, that seems like a much more productive way to approach the problem. I think the other thing that to me is always worrisome, let's say, about the question of the MOOC is the danger of calcifying teaching, or the danger of producing a course and spending a lot of time on it. And I think for me, this is where the question of money comes back in, and why I'm a big fan of cheap and dirty. Once things become expensive, they tend to become sort of like these calcified whales that people just want to keep using. And I think one of the things that I think we really have to keep in mind is how can they remain nimble, or how can they remain changeable? And I think that's really important because, when you teach in a university, you're never teaching the same thing again. You're always having conversations with your colleagues, with your students. You're engaging with the latest research. All of that needs to take place. It gets reflected, let's say, in the classroom. And I think that needs to get incorporated into the way that we're thinking about the MOOC. So thinking about the ways that they're structured to allow for nimbleness, or allow for flexibility, or editing, or going back over, I think to me is super important. So that's sort of a general thing. I think maybe that probably applies to more than one discipline. Specifically about architecture, and again, this goes back to my earlier points about the media or mediation of architecture itself, and how it's related or has affinities towards the media of video. I think in that way, like, we're at an enormous advantage to other fields, let's say, because a lot of our work and a lot of our practice already involves thinking through translations of media. That's what we do all the time. You look at drawings and you look at buildings and you think about what made the drawing become the building and all the work that happened in between. You look at a building and think about its precedents. You think about those translations across historical time. You think about the building in an urban environment, and you think about translations in scale, from the scale of the human figure to the scale of the urban or the city. All of those questions, I think, are questions of translations of media and mediation. And I think as well on the screen is yet another form of that. So taking that quite seriously is how we teach, and acknowledging that this is always how we've taught architecture, I think, is one of the huge advantages that we might have over other fields that don't center that kind of representation in their work. And I think this has immediately repercussions. So, for example, when you're looking at historical examples or talking about a precedent, you can have many images immediately on the screen in front of your students' eyes at a much closer level, let's say, than you'd have in an auditorium. And for our field, that actually makes a huge difference. Vis-a-vis what we're teaching. So I think that, to me, that seems like we should really lean into that and try to think about how to, again, make apparent that that's what we're doing when we're thinking about teaching architecture online.
No, what you're saying makes a lot of sense to me, because my kind of vision on this thing is that it should resemble a bit more like a video game industry, in the sense that they produce a very bad game, bad beta or early beta closed access version of a game, of a movie, and then through feedbacks like the one you're saying that you didn't have, they improve this basic version into a much more playable or enjoyable version. And I think nobody in the MOOC area has done that so far, because maybe it's some, because there's some ancient practice on how to work with editorial stuff, you know, like you really have to put out a very polished product like a book, you know. But in like digital things are different, because you get like a lot of resources, like feedback resources that you can work on. No, that's just my thought. And taking on the thread that I think that cannot really work digitally, I want to ask you, maybe it's just like a provocation question, and you already answered that. That in an architecture school, which is maybe different from other disciplines, like more than half of the energy goes into studio, like into teaching, and students' energy definitely are much more focused on studio than on like theoretical courses, sadly. How do you think that the MOOC could take some parts of it, like MOOC logic or MOOC format, can take some performativity in the studio teaching?
Yeah.
Have you thought about that?
That's a really difficult question. And I think is related to what we've been talking about now, which is let's say the inability for it to be a two-way street. I mean, because the definition of the MOOC is that it's massive, which means that you can have a student producing amazing work that just kind of, in a sense, goes into the void to some extent, you know, and that doesn't really work for a lot of the ways that our studio pedagogy is structured, you know. So, you know, right now when we're thinking about teaching studio online, it has nothing to do really with that kind of model. I don't know. I have to think about that. I think it's a good question. I mean, I think that if you take away the massive part of the MOOC away from it and just talk about online education, then I think for sure there's a lot that can be learned. I think once you're talking about the scale question in terms of the student to faculty ratio, I think it becomes a much different kind of question. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense enough, but.
Yeah, a bit. No. I before all this MOOC interest I have, I was checking on the pedagogical approach they have towards architecture in mainland China, and they usually have much larger a larger number of students ratio compared to the US in terms of the ratio of academic and student. So in the Chinese University of Hong Kong, there's a professor Wu Daqing, I can write it, and he developed, and this is not like an online thing, it's more like a methodology, a method to teach tectonics in the Swiss way, like form of words, like kind of like very ETH approach, for a very broad group of students. So there are ways to I think there's research on this, but it hasn't been applied to like an online platform. It's more like textbook things how to deal with that, because actually there's a lot of things in the studio which are automated already. Like,
yeah,
we think they're mystical and spontaneous, but there are a lot of things that we just repeat.
Yeah. No, you're right. I think it's useful to think about.
Not just like a thought.
Yeah.
To leave it open, and this is the last question. It's more like I gave a lot of opinions. I'm sorry, I should keep that from the end. And this is like my last opinion, and is the two things that I personally question. I would like to hear about this from you, about the first way of architecture MOOCs and MOOCs in general, is the way they handle both two things, celebrity and evaluation or assessment, as you say. And in the first part, celebrity, they promote their courses with celebrity professors that later on students might realize, or will realize, that are not really involved at all in the evaluation process of the MOOC. And that could turn into like a disappointment in the service that it's provided. And this criticism of mine is only purely based on my limited experience in product design and marketing.
Yeah.
Yet the master class format, maybe the master class format is some way you can see particularly your MOOC, and particularly the core content of the MOOC is something worth discussing in an online environment, particularly with automated evaluations, which is the norm in automated MOOCs, accreditation MOOCs. And that's my first criticism, that it relies a lot on these influencers. And the second, we already talked about this, is about evaluation. I understand this is simple because MOOCs, like you said just before, are open and massive. So they have to be functional in any device, browser, on internet or Wi-Fi connection, without relying on sophisticated technology, which might prove to limit its openness to a massive public. And this thing happens to me because I already work on 2 MOOCs that both were scrapped, and in those both 2 MOOCs I sent some questions to EDX, and both times all the replies were like, no, you cannot do it, you cannot do it, you cannot do it. So I cannot do like any of the things I wanted.
Yeah, you cannot. Yeah, no, we found like you cannot. That's usually the answer. You cannot do it. We have also found that. I mean, I think maybe there's a couple of things. One is sort of like the clunkiness of the online platform tool. And to be honest, this is totally beyond my domain because I'm not a web developer and I don't have enough knowledge in that that field to know how to push that forward. But it seems clear that could be one way to think about the question in terms of, the way that edX is set up now. They have a very specific kind of platform that allows for a very specific set of operations. And when we were working on the Harvard Imagination course, we just had to work within that, that was a function of the limits of our own expertise and also just wanting to get a project that would get off the ground, let's say. So maybe that's one area, and again, I can't really speak to that because I don't have enough knowledge in web development to be able to say. One of the things that we were very conscious about, though, and we've touched on this a little bit as well in the beginning, was that these ideas of these self-assessments, when we're thinking about student assessments, that we wanted to make sure that we were building into the assessment a clarity for the student in terms of why we were asking them to do that work. And to me, this has actually been kind of groundbreaking in the way that I teach in general, because, we had to say, okay, we're asking you to write a formal analysis of this building. And then in the self-assessment part of it, we had to say the reason we assigned this essay is because, understanding the way that formal parts of a building's relationships to one another has been an important part of the way that we have analyzed architecture in the past and blah, blah, blah. And so, just revealing once again the point of the exercise, for me at least, if a student is taking it in good faith, I think would go a long way in terms of letting them understand why we're crafting these assignments in the first place. And I think you could start to do that with the design exercises. I don't think it could go all the way. So, we did that with the draw your own building or living space assignment, where we asked them to think about scale. We asked them to think about wall thickness, and all of these questions came after the initial prompt, so that they were, not only asked to self-analyze their own drawing work, but then given prompts to be thinking about what it was that they were actually doing when they were doing that drawing. That's kind of, as far as we've come up with, or as far as I've come up with. But I think, again, this to me feels like one of the real places to push and to explore, to develop other tools of student work that are even more interesting in terms of their use of the digital technology. So, I think this is a huge area of mine, at least, and I think potential for growth. And I think that goes beyond the question of the platform. I think you could think about it with the platform, but I think you could also think about it in terms of real pedagogical questions. So what is the intent of these assignments that you're asking students to produce? I don't know if that answer the question.
Yeah,
I don't even remember the question.
No, what I'm my thesis that I want to develop, like the course I'm doing, or maybe information, is that there are ways that we can still experiment on how to entrench or mix the content and the assessment, and not take them as separately, And that's
Absolutely.
why video games don't only come in as my nerd interest in video games, but also because that's really like one way to mix audiovisual things and quiz,
Yeah.
and puzzles, of a certain kind, which might or might not relate to architecture directly or indirectly. You know, architecture can be like directly assessed, or can be just a background, and you get architecture learning like through osmosis. You know, in a more passive way. There are many ways to learn. You know, like the objectives have to be usually very clear, but sometimes they don't have to be like so. Yeah. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I really like the idea that I think one of the things that was super fun about doing the imagination course with Michael is that we understood that there was many different kinds of audiences that might engage with it. And that to both of us was really exciting. So we wanted to produce something that would be engaging for master's level students, but that could also be accessible to someone with a smart person just interested in the subject with no prior knowledge whatsoever. And then depending on what level of engagement that they would have with the material, they could sort of choose your own adventure through it, you know. So exactly to your point that someone might be taking the course because they're interested in potentially starting a career in architecture, so might want to learn a little bit more about how one thinks about architectural history. Or it could also be taken, by someone who has never thought about architecture at all, but just is interested in visiting, traveling, and wants to think about the new ways to think about buildings around them or something. And it's been very gratifying because we've got a number of responses from students that have completed the course, and it's always wonderful to get them that really have this very wide range of interest, or, you know, what they got out of it has ranged dramatically from, you know, I loved your course because of Erica Naginski's episode on Alberti, and that was why I liked it, you know, very specific, to I loved your course because the whole sequence taught me a new way of seeing the city. And so to me, these are very different kinds of responses, you know. To someone, they're grabbed by a particular analysis of a particular structure, and that opens up a new way of thinking. For others, it's like a deep dive into this whole analysis of a number of different examples that might cause them to think differently about architecture as a whole. So I feel like that's exactly maybe a little bit of a micro version of what you're talking about, but I really like the possibility of pushing this kind of thing further. And I can completely imagine actually that can get expanded. So you have, like, instead of a course being longer, it just gets deeper. So you have like the first level that's like an introduction, and then the next level is like much more nuanced or in depth of that same material. And then I can imagine that expanding sort of downwards instead of acrosswards.
Yeah, it could be like more like an overdose than like a light dose. And
Totally.
Be saturated of architecture for a while, and then you get
absolutely
about it when you're offline, not when you're online.
Yeah.
But there are many ways to approach that. And one last question came up just when you're talking about this kind of audiences or the different kinds of public, is that, for instance, the two Japanese books on architecture that I mentioned, both are very, like, in a way, commercially and pragmatic, in the sense that they are addressed to our high school students, or to get, if they want to study architecture, they study architecture in any of these two schools. And in the case of, and there's like an aesthetic or there's a very clear agenda on that. In the Tokyo Institute of Technology, you can see that students who look still young, they're not like very old adult students like learning, which there are very young students, they interview their professors. So it's like for them to like feel themselves like a mirror in these students. Whereas in the Tokyo University, the one we talked with Oguchi, the one with the nice music, is clearly towards a very simple approach to architecture. In this case, it's very complex. You have like how to explain to a kid the architecture of Arata Isozaki. Maybe impossible. But in your MOOC, and my question is this: if this was delivered or not? It seems to me that it's kind of targeted with this idea of the slides and how it's filmed and all that. Maybe this is Michael's work, maybe not yours, as something targeted to an adult, middle-aged adult, and I would include myself, who's going back to the university. It's kind of that kind of approach. Am I right?
I didn't think about that. So the slides were a very conscious trope, let's say. Again, so that we could, it was like, one of these things that we were hoping to say unconsciously, this is a MOOC about architecture and it's about images in architecture. And, starting with the slides all the time was us to say, remember what you're looking at is images. And again, these have a very specific point of view, so that was absolutely on purpose. I think for us, less of a nostalgic, but although I can totally see how it would be read as that, and more of an indication that we are aware of the artifice of the situation. So, yeah, I don't know. It was definitely, I think could be read both ways, maybe, and maybe that's okay. Maybe it also appeals to sort of a old-timey art historical sensibility with the slide reel and all that, because absolutely that's what it is also doing. So
no, yeah. The concept that it transmits to me is that this is analog. This is analog architecture. This is not digital, which is okay, or maybe history.
Yeah, no, but it's so funny you say that, because like for me, it's clearly digital, because it's like, even the way that we have all the slides laid out, you would never show, that's not how a slide projector works at all, yeah. So for me, it was like, the intention was, here's us translating once again between this analog image making and this digital image making. This is on purpose, the way that we're going to be talking through these images. But you're right. Maybe that's another, a better way to read it, or maybe that's how it comes across.
Different point of view, right?
Yeah. The fact is also a lot of the images that we used are from that era of architectural history that would have been showed in slide projectors with the 2 slides and all that. So there's no question that it's also resonates with the material that we're showing,
So thank you, Lisa, for your time. It was very revealing. We have a lot of new information on your MOOC that hasn't been seen anywhere else. So I like this. I like this about interviews, that we get new stuff. Thank you very much for your time.